Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace. Welcome back. This is week 2 of our Friday night selected reading and reflections from the Bhagavad Gita. And I have maybe, half a dozen quotes that I wanted to look at that really spoke to me, which kind of are ones that I try to pick ones that I find myself thinking back to in my own life when I'm going through various things. That is assuming that I'm not at that moment reading the Gita, which is a good possibility, since I probably read the Gita, maybe 4 or 5 times a year, or listen to it, if not read it. It's always there. So the first thing I should say is in chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita, the Battle of Kurukshetra is imminent. We kind of established that in chapter 1. Krishna and Arjuna are literally in the middle of the battlefield. And at the end of chapter 1, Arjuna has cast aside his bow and sat down on the ground, very upset. In chapter 2, we get a couple of things. First and foremost, we get basically a summary of the Gita's contents. In chapter 2, Krishna basically outlines most of the teachings in a rough way that he's going to expound upon throughout the course of these 18 chapters. And on that note, we're also hearing from Krishna for the first time, really. In chapter 1, we were hearing from Sanjaya, the visionary who's recounting these events to Dhritarashtra, the blind king, and we hear from Arjuna. We don't hear too much from Krishna. So now Krishna is going to dominate most of this second chapter. But the first quote I want to start with is one of my favorites from Arjuna. This is chapter 2, verse 7. My will is paralyzed and I am utterly confused. Tell me, which is the better path for me? Let me be your disciple. I have fallen at your feet. Give me instruction. So here we have the perfect example of surrender to the divine, to a higher order of thinking than our own, to a broader range of perceptions. Of course, ultimately, this higher order of thinking, that broader range of perceptions, this wisdom, already exists in us, just as it exists in Arjuna. But he's forgotten. If it were not the case that this knowledge already existed in Arjuna somewhere, then Krishna would not have begun by first simply telling him to just get up and fight, which is what he does a few verses earlier, where Krishna basically says, look, you got to get up and fight. Come on, let's go. He doesn't expound any great knowledge of the Vedas or any metaphysical truths about the spiritual life. He doesn't bother with any of that. This is very common in stories in Hinduism, where a guru, a teacher, a deity, whoever it might be, if they are in a dialogue with a student, they tend to pull from the top shelf first. They want to get to the heart of the matter and the essential truths. And a lot of times that involves throwing basically the simplest but perhaps most difficult to accept answer. And then, only then, does the teacher or the guru work their way down to maybe easier to swallow pills or more easily digested information, or more practical information. We see that if you ever listen to the dialogues that Sri Ramana Maharshi would have with his students. He always goes for the top shelf. And I suppose the thinking is, well, look, we're in the business of enlightenment, liberation. We're trying to get to moksha here. So why waste time with beating around the bush, so to speak, if the student is ready to digest those deeper, perhaps more difficult truths, or more, maybe not more difficult, but perhaps more abstract truths, I suppose. Why not just start there? Seems to be the thinking. So we kind of see that here in this very old text, and you see that all the way up to more contemporary teachers as well. Of course, Krishna is much more than just a guru or a teacher. He is, of course, a god. In any case, once it becomes clear to Krishna that Arjuna has forgotten this knowledge, then he begins to explain things to him in a more detailed way. Now, what Arjuna has not forgotten, even though he forgets himself, and what he does not forsake, even though he wants to forsake the battle, is the fact that Krishna, his guide, can help him. So there's this idea that I think a lot of people have about religious persons, regardless of what specific religion we're talking about, that primarily religion functions as sort of an anchor or something that people can fall back on or rely on, which is probably a major aspect of it. But I think what this forgets is that reliance is something that admits of degrees. And just because someone has maybe somewhere within them a conviction about God or about some sort of spiritual truth, that this is necessarily always easily accessible to them, that they experience no moments of doubt or indecision. And yet we find that in Arjuna. Keep in mind that Arjuna has already made a decision to make Krishna his guide. He has already decided that Krishna is someone he can rely on to provide invaluable guidance. And that guidance was actually worth more to Arjuna than all the soldiers in Krishna's army. That's what we saw, that's what happened before the Gita begins, when Krishna offers his help to Duryodhana and to Arjuna. He offers to one of them his army, and to the other his guidance. But he lets Arjuna pick first. That's very important. So we know it wasn't just, it wouldn't have had as much of an impact if he let Duryodhana pick first, because then there'd always be that question of, well, maybe Arjuna would have picked the army. But we know that he wouldn't, because he's a faithful devotee and he's an honorable man. Duryodhana has no respect for the deities, doesn't respect Krishna. So Arjuna is a faithful devotee of Krishna. We know that. Even so, he's experiencing this doubt. This decision that Arjuna made, between the army and Krishna as advisor, you could say that this decision was made at a moment when the Battle of Kurukshetra was still just an abstraction. But now it's something very real. He is literally in the middle of the battlefield. He cannot look away from it. And so this prostration before Krishna that we see in chapter 2 is very different from that initial choice he made prior to the events of the Gita, when he selected Krishna's guidance over his soldiers. The prostration that we see here in the second chapter of the Gita is what you could call a total surrender. And these moments of total surrender in the spiritual life are almost always precedented by exactly the sort of bewilderment, hopelessness, and indecision that Arjuna describes himself as experiencing. Not sure why, but that just seems to be the way it works. When we recommit ourselves to our faith, whatever that might be, it's almost always prefaced by something terrible happening. It's never like, I'm having a great day, I think I'll recommit myself to my faith. No, that doesn't ever really happen. Again, I don't know why, I don't make the rules, but that just seems to be the way it is. William James, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, made a similar observation somewhere in that book. Just as he forgets himself in the face of the battle, Arjuna could have also forgotten his faith in his guide if he were not such a faithful devotee. I suppose it could have just as well been the case that Arjuna, seeing the battle about to unfold, maybe he determines that Krishna's guidance really isn't going to help him much. Or maybe he resents Krishna. Maybe he reconsiders his choice from before. Like, seeing this big army, maybe I should have taken Krishna up on his offer of giving me his army. How much help is he going to be in this chariot with me? But, of course, he doesn't say any of those things. He doesn't do any of those things. And the reason, most basically, for that is it's just not in his nature. It is perfectly in Duryodhana's nature to reject Krishna's help and instead choose the extra battalion of troops from Krishna's army. But Arjuna does not have the same nature as Duryodhana. Duryodhana is the type of guy who knows the wrong thing, but does it anyway. Knows fully well that he is wicked, but it's just in his nature to be wicked. Arjuna, on the other hand, is a faithful devotee. Now, it's tempting perhaps to interpret this as meaning that Arjuna's faith as a devotee is somehow deeper or more essential to who he is than his duty as a warrior. After all, if he is even suggesting the notion of abandoning the battle and needs Krishna to convince him otherwise if he's going to stick it out, then perhaps we could interpret this to mean that even if he would abandon his duty as a warrior, he could not abandon his faith in God. But here we arrive at one of the central themes of the Gita, which is precisely this, that one's duty and one's devotion to God are intricately bound up in one another. The notion that one could choose between one's duty and one's devotion to God doesn't really make sense within the context of this system. Because to perform one's duty in the world to the best of one's ability, whatever that duty might be, as we will soon hear from Krishna, is itself the way in which one devotes themselves to God. At least if we're following the path of karma yoga, which is essentially the path that Krishna recommends to Arjuna. Although, of course, as we'll see in the next, in subsequent chapters, other paths of yoga are outlined as well, but it is ultimately the karma yoga path that Krishna seems to feel Arjuna is best suited for. So it definitely gets a lot of emphasis in the Gita, but it's not the only path that is discussed. On that view, then, the idea of abandoning one's duty and abandoning God are not different. We cannot choose one and leave the other. Of course, if it were that simple, then no dilemma would arise for Arjuna at all, nor for us. But it is rather precisely because Arjuna feels he's conflicted between two duties, between his duty to his family and his duty as a warrior, that his mind has become muddled with confusion. So it would be very simple if it was just a matter of, hey, actually doing your job, that's how you can devote yourself to God. But that's not really what the big problem is here for Arjuna. It's that the duties that he feels obligated towards seem mutually exclusive. So Krishna's task here is not only to convince Arjuna of the importance of doing his duty, but also to address his concern that his duty to his family and his duty as a soldier can be reconciled. So how does Krishna go about doing that? Well, the next passage I want to read from is verses 9 through 13, where Krishna responds to Arjuna. You speak sincerely, but your sorrow has no cause. The wise grieve neither for the living nor for the dead. There has never been a time when you and I and the kings gathered here have not existed, nor will there be a time when we will cease to exist. As the same person inhabits the body through childhood, youth, and old age, so too at the time of death he attains a new body. The wise are not deluded by this. So here we see Krishna expounding on the basics of reincarnation. And given the fact that one's soul passes from one body to the next at the moment of death, the grief over the inevitable demise of his allies and his enemies are equally unfounded. Not insincere, but not rational. Okay, so Krishna is empathizing with Arjuna. He's not being cold. He's being very compassionate. He's saying, look, I understand, like, emotionally where you're getting these ideas from, but we need to think rationally here. And rationally, what you're saying doesn't make sense. It's not rational within the context of Arjuna's own belief system, assuming that, of course, that he accepts the basic tenet of reincarnation, which, yes, he does, of course. But in those moments of profound disillusionment and confusion, doubts flare up, and one often needs to be reminded at times of some of the essentials of their faith. A Christian, for example, knows on some level that they are forgiven by God through the blood of Christ. They're forgiven for all their sins, past, present, and future. That's kind of basic to the Christian faith. They hear it every Sunday. They can't help but see it in nearly every page of the New Testament. The work is done, you're forgiven, and so on. Yet, this doesn't stop Christians from experiencing guilt or shame over their failures, mistakes, or sins. This can produce a double confusion, actually. You know, how can one really say they believe in God and believe that they're forgiven, yet doubt that he's forgiven them at the same time? Well, I think the answer to this mystery lies in the fact that this is such a common phenomenon for people of Christian faith, and there are equivalent problems for people of other faiths as well. Why else do practitioners of whatever religion you want to choose need to read literature, need to attend services or rituals, need to meditate, pray, or practice some kind of exercise? Because much of the work in spiritual life consists of remembering, which is kind of a theme I want to explore here with some of these other quotes as well. But perhaps that's why the word remember is included in this triad of edicts on the cover of the classic Be Here Now. It says remember in 4 places on this book. Love, serve, remember is kind of a mantra of Ram Dass, the author of this book. Which is interesting because I think sometimes this remembering is one of the hardest things to do, but one of the most important things to do. And it's one of the things that I think characterizes much of the work and practice that make up spiritual paths. In verses 19 through 21, Krishna continues talking to Arjuna and says, "One believes he is the slayer, another believes he is the slain. Both are ignorant. There is neither slayer nor slain. You were never born. You will never die. You have never changed. You can never change. Unborn, eternal, immutable, immemorial, you do not die when the body dies. Realizing that which is indestructible, eternal, unborn, and unchanging, how can you slay or cause another to slay?" This next phrase, that no one is slain, no one is the slayer, follows from an even deeper spiritual truth than that of reincarnation. It's in fact partially what the idea of reincarnation is built on, right? We're talking about what is reincarnated. This all has to do with what is referred to in this book as the self, capital S self, as distinct from the lowercase s self, which is, roughly correlates to our idea of the ego. And what is this self, which plays such an important role in the Gita? Well, Krishna describes the self in verses 23 through 25 The self cannot be pierced by weapons or burned by fire. Water cannot wet it, nor can the wind dry it. The self cannot be pierced or burned, made wet or dry. It is everlasting and infinite, standing on the motionless foundations of eternity. The self is unmanifested, beyond all thought, beyond all change. Knowing this, you should not grieve. As someone that does a lot of talks on philosophy, primarily Western philosophy, I got to admit, I do grieve sometimes when I find out that the self is beyond all thought, because isn't that what we love to do so much, philosophers? We like thought, we like thinking. If I can't think it, how can it be? So it's interesting how much the Gita takes me out of my philosopher mode. I am not in philosopher mode when I read the Gita. And I'm not in philosopher mode when I talk about the Gita. So philosopher hat is somewhere else right now, and I'll put it back on later. But when it comes to the Gita and things of that nature. Now, I just want to jump back a little bit to verse 16, where Krishna says, "The impermanent has no reality. Reality lies in the eternal. Those who have seen the boundary between these two have attained the end of all knowledge." So here we see this place where the Vedic philosophy and the Buddhist philosophy depart from one another. As I like to put it, Hinduism and Buddhism agree on the idea that much, if not all, of what we perceive is illusory. Where they differ, at least in their metaphysics, has to do with what follows from this idea. So in Buddhism, once we cut through the illusion, what do we find? We find emptiness, nothing. And that follows from things like dependent origination, things of that nature. The idea that everything originates from something else, so ultimately there's nothing. You can look at the Abhidharma for a really good take on kind of the magnum opus in terms of texts on dependent origination and how the psyche works. It's sometimes called the text of Buddhist psychology, the Abhidharma. In Hinduism, on the other hand, at least as the Gita is concerned, once we cut through the illusion, we don't find emptiness, we don't find nothing. One way you could say it is we find everything, or perhaps more properly speaking, we find that which is real. So there's this idea in Hinduism that there is, in fact, something real and unchanging. But the world of sense, of course, is not that. Whereas in Buddhism, everything is impermanent. Everything is always changing. So that's kind of one way I look at the differences between the metaphysics of Buddhism and that of Hinduism. The Gita describes something which is really real, the true reality, something which is eternal and unchanging. So what he's saying when he says there's no slayer and no slain, he's saying that what Arjuna does to, quote unquote, his enemies, or what his enemies do, quote unquote, to him, they're really not doing anything to each other in the sense of their eternal, unchanging, immutable, capital S self. What Krishna tells Arjuna that this unchanging, really real thing is the self, and that is the thing towards which Arjuna should be focusing his attention and his concern. And there will be plenty more talk on this self throughout the Gita. Remember, chapter 2 is really kind of an outline for many of the major themes that the Gita will touch on. One of the major themes of the Gita is, as I said earlier, karma yoga, among other paths as well. But like I said, there's definitely more of an emphasis on karma yoga because that's the one that Arjuna is ostensibly best suited for. It's the one that Krishna appears to recommend to him. And here Krishna describes in verses 47 and 48 very succinctly the basic thesis of karma yoga. He says, "You have the right to work, but never to the fruit of work. You should never engage in action for the sake of reward, nor should you long for inaction. Perform work in this world, Arjuna, as a man established within himself, without selfish attachments, alike in success and defeat, for yoga is perfect evenness of mind." One thing that I think is crucial is something that I learned from a teacher I had on the Gita, is that it is not through brute force that one can detach from the results of their work, but that rather it is from the practice of yoga, meditation, and from being established within oneself, rather than, say, in the world, that one following from this can detach from the results of their work and instead situate themselves in the self. So in other words, I'm not trying to detach myself from my work or from the fruits of my work in order to attain the self. No, the self is already me. Part of the problem is the fact that I think I need to attain this self. I mean, that's kind of, that occupies much of the work of, someone like Ramana Maharshi. Get over this illusion that you need to attain the self. You already are the self. That sort of thing. But no, I am not trying to detach myself from the fruits of my work in order to attain the self, like it's a goal to achieve. Rather, it's from situating myself in the big self, being in that mindset through practicing the yoga and meditation, that I am able to detach myself from the result of my work. The little self, ego, I don't want to detach from the fruits of my work. That's the part of me that likes the fruits of my work and wants to do things for personal gain. This higher self, if you want to call it that, the capital S self, the Atman, has no need for the fruits of work. I think that's the thing that is hardest to get over is like there's this fear that, well, I need the fruits of my work. Otherwise, why am I going to do them? And it's like, come on in, the water's great. When you're in that mindset, and I'm not someone who's in this mindset very often, I'll admit. But when I am in this mindset that Krishna is talking about here, where you're situated in yourself, it's just gravy. I mean, everything just goes so smoothly. And I'm still able to perform work. Like when I'm doing videos like these, the best I feel is when I'm just being myself and just doing the best I can and not getting so fixated on making everything perfect. Actually, some of the videos that I've stressed out the most and have tried to make perfect, those haven't been very popular. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's the cosmic joke, playing a joke on me, kind of trying to get my attention. In fact, one of my most popular videos is one which I think is really, I did not have much knowledge of how to make videos at that time. I didn't have much knowledge on how to lecture at the time. And yet that one has received, the most views. And so it kind of just goes to show that, like, I really have no control over like 99.9% of things in the world. And when I remember that, my life is a lot easier. So to me, that's kind of a good segue to this, what does it mean to be established within oneself? Well, I've been told by basically the same person that essentially this means being satisfied in oneself, not feeling like you're losing something if someone doesn't act the way you want, not feeling like you're missing out on something if you don't have something material, or it could be even something social. Like for me, I use like being in a relationship as an example. So being situated within yourself within this context, we could say is like not being in a relationship, but also not feeling like you're missing out because of that fact. But also not feeling like you can't be in a relationship. That's the dialectic. That's the middle grounds that we're trying to get to, that the Gita endorses. The Gita doesn't endorse asceticism, at least not for Arjuna. It does talk about asceticism, but Arjuna is not qualified, or he's not of the right, it's not his path, is something that Krishna more or less tells him pretty explicitly, which is one of the most interesting insights in the Gita, in my view, is this idea that asceticism is a path for people for whom it's their path. And for the rest of us, we need to figure something else out. The ascetic path can seem very tempting, but from my reading of ascetics and monastics, most of them describe their calling to that path as being just that, as feeling like they were called to it, not that they chose it or that they thought logically about it and were like, yeah, being an ascetic, that's the most logical choice, I'll do that. I don't think that's how it works. In verses 62 to 63, we have kind of a process. Maybe one of the most, this is probably one of the most like analyzed passages, I think, in the Gita. Definitely one of the most. And I've seen a lot of really good videos done just on these two shlokas, because it sums up, it's kind of a psychology lesson, basically. And Krishna tells Arjuna, when you keep thinking about sense objects, attachment comes. Attachment breeds desire, the lust of possession that burns to anger. Anger clouds the judgment, and you can no longer learn from past mistakes. Lost is the power to choose between what is wise and what is unwise, and your life is an utter waste. So we have this process described from which one passes from a state in which they are free of the bonds of attachment and suffering, and then through forgetting, there's that forgetting again, the importance of remembering in spiritual practices. Through forgetting one's true self, or forgetting the practices, slacking off on your meditation, slacking off on yoga, one lowers oneself almost to the level of a beast. And in some translations, I think that last sentence is translated as you become like a beast. In the Easwaran translation, it's translated as your life becomes an utter waste. Either way, not so good. And I like how this process unfolds. Like I said, it's kind of a psychology lesson, And what is interesting is that when you practice meditation, particularly meditation which involves just watching the thoughts come and go, you can see this process for yourself happening in real time. Because I think a lot of people think meditation is about clearing your mind. Good luck with that. Even the most experienced meditators will tell you, that it just doesn't happen. And when it does, it's very brief. No, the aim of meditation is to learn about how crazy our minds are. And to learn to sit with that and not react to it. So when I sit for meditation and watch my thoughts come and go, all these crazy ideas come, all these like temptations to start thinking about something other than the breath, or, what did I forget to do for work? What did I forget to hand in for school? All this stuff, within seconds of sitting down on the cushion comes up. That's part of the practice. The practice is to watch and see just how transient it all is. One thought comes and then another one is right after it, and then that goes on for a while, and then eventually, oh, this is nice. It's been a while since I've had a thought, and then that lasts about 5 seconds, and then, oh, I think I'm going to have ice cream tonight. It doesn't stop. That's not the goal of meditation. The goal of meditation is that something deeper than the mind can emerge. Because if I'm the one watching these thoughts, I got to start asking, well, obviously I'm not these thoughts, otherwise how could I watch them? Now we're getting into more Ramana Maharshi stuff. I've been on kind of a Ramana Maharshi kick lately, so forgive me, I'm maybe blending the two a little bit too much. But what's great about this kind of meditation practice is that the more that I practice it, the more I can see it in my life. You know, when I'm not sitting on a cushion and I'm driving, or I'm sitting somewhere with other people, you know, the meditation practice is called a practice because you're practicing for regular life. You know, we're practicing for being off the cushion. That's how it was explained to me, anyway. So now we get the other side of this coin in the next couple of verses, where Krishna says, "But when you move amidst the world of sense, free from attachment and aversion alike, there comes the peace in which all sorrows end, and you live in the wisdom of the self, capital S self." And then I wanted to end with perhaps my favorite quote in all of the Gita, which is found in chapter 2, and that is verse 40, where Krishna says, "On this path, effort never goes to waste, and there is no failure. Even a little effort towards spiritual awareness will protect you from the greatest fear." The greatest fear that he's talking about is this fear that Arjuna expresses, that he will fail, even if he were to attempt to put into practice the things that Krishna is saying. And Krishna is saying emphatically, that is impossible. No effort on the spiritual path, regardless of what path you happen to be walking, goes to waste. And that is something that really spoke to me the first time that I read the Gita. And it's something that it's actually on the very front page of this copy, which I really love. I mean, what a great opener. I really believe that. When I heard something like that, that was one of the most compassionate things I had ever heard in a religious text. I would put this right up there with, you know, "For God so loved the world" and all that. This is there's a Greek word for this, theophany. So you have the word epiphany, right? Epi, meaning like epiphenomenal, epicenter, you know, it's immediate, the world right here. Theo, the divine, God, and phany, which is, you know, meeting or perceiving. So it's a meeting with a God. Theophany. Learned that word while I was reading Plato. Someone had described the Credo as a theophany. I don't know if Socrates was a god. God-like, maybe. So I absolutely love that quote. It's just, I just love it. I will see everyone next Friday. Obviously, this isn't being filmed live like last week was. Last week's video, by the time this is uploaded, probably won't be listed. There's some kinks I'm trying to work out in that video. The sound I really wasn't that happy with, so I'm not doing the live streaming until I really, know what I'm doing. That is not because I need it to be perfect, but I would at least like it to be listenable. I would like it to not be unpleasant for someone to listen to. So, balancing all that out. But this has been a really good experience for me, getting back in touch with this incredible piece of writing. And I hope that others are benefiting from it as well. Thanks so much, and have a good weekend.